Hi, my name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am an addictions physician working out of Toronto, Canada.
Have you ever wondered why it's so hard to keep away from certain foods even after you've decided to stop? It's like a magnet that pulls you back, each time stronger than before. This struggle, my friends, is known as food addiction. It's a distressing cycle, one that often leaves individuals feeling helpless and trapped. Let's consider the story of Jane. She decided to quit sugar, but 3 days later, she found herself binging on a family-sized chocolate bar. And then she ate the rest of the ice cream in her freezer, and in a matter of hours, all the leftover pastries from the party the night before. The guilt and disappointment that followed were overwhelming. What Jane was experiencing was not a lack of willpower. Food addiction and relapse to food addiction after some sobriety is complex, with roots embedded deep within our biology, psychology, and our environment. Relapse, in the context of addiction, is a return to the addictive behavior after a period of abstinence, whether it be days, months, even years. It's not just a single event, but a process. It begins with emotional relapse, where negative emotions trigger cravings, or euphoric recall, where you dwell on the good old days when your drug produced pleasure. Remember the pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving and the shortbread cookies at Christmas? Then it progresses to mental relapse, where the internal battle begins. A part of you wants to use, but another part resists. The cravings have returned with a vengeance and seem worse the harder you try to resist. And finally, there is physical relapse, where the physical need to use the drug becomes too intense to hold back. It is simply easier to give in. In this video, we will cover the biology of addiction, how the brain's reward system gets hijacked, and seems to remain hijacked, even into sobriety. Then we will look at how psychological factors contribute to this dilemma, how repeated use leads to a dizzying array of triggers that unearth cravings you thought were long buried. Finally, we look at how social and environmental factors add further to the struggle. Understanding the interplay of factors, you could wonder why relapse does not happen more often than it does. You might even ask, how can recovery even be possible? But recovery is possible. With a platform of relapse prevention tools, a person can live sober and free from relapse for the long term. So, what is happening inside our brain when we relapse? Let's explore the biology behind it. The brain is a complex organ, and its workings during relapse are even more intricate. One of the key players in the relapse process is dopamine, a neurotransmitter that gives us that feel-good rush when we indulge in a craving. In the case of food addiction, the foods we crave stimulate the release of dopamine, making us feel good and reinforcing the desire to eat more of these foods. These are typically sugary, fatty, and salty processed foods. However, if we repeatedly stimulate dopamine release, our brain adapts by down-regulating the number of dopamine receptors. It does this so that the abundance of dopamine is blunted, and the rush is reduced to a mild pleasure. Consequently, normal rewards seem less appealing as the brain adjusts its baseline for pleasure. And the super-exciting foods dull over time. This is called tolerance. The addict will now need more food, more dopamine, to get the desired euphoric effect. For example, while one cookie was delightful the first time you tasted it, 1 week later, even the bag of cookies leaves you flat, still wanting more. On the biological side, this is because there are fewer receptors available for dopamine to bind to, making the experience blunted and less intense. And here's the twist. The remaining dopamine receptors become highly sensitive in response. Like watchmen on high alert, they're constantly on the lookout for more dopamine, making the cravings even stronger over time. This is despite the fact that there are fewer receptors, so whatever dopamine does manage to get through to our brain cells is highly absorbed. And if another binge of drug food follows, bringing another wallop of dopamine with it, more downregulation occurs. And this dance between the neuronal response and the drug food inevitably leads the person into a neuronal mismatch that we call addiction. In essence, the biology behind relapse is like a domino effect. The downregulation of dopamine receptors leads paradoxically to stronger cravings, which in turn lead to diminished impulse control and memory impairment. These changes then feed into each other, creating a cycle that's difficult to break. Addiction is a powerful mental derangement of our neurochemistry. Prolonged sugar exposure can also impact our brain structure and function. Note that it is not just sugar, but processed foods in general can cause this damage. Certainly, studies have shown that overuse of drug foods can lead to a decrease in gray and white neuronal matter. This brain tissue is vital for our brain's functioning, such as willpower and impulse control. These are diminished and can make it even harder to curb cravings and resist relapse. Moreover, prolonged sugar exposure can affect the hippocampus, a region of the brain crucial for memory formation. When the hippocampus is compromised, our short-term memory can suffer, making it hard for us to remember the negative consequences of our past actions. This memory impairment can make us more susceptible to relapse, as we typically forget the distress and discomfort that followed our previous indulgences. Oddly, we are spared the memories of the good times, but we seem to forget how awful we felt once the boxes and bags of our favorite foods lay empty beside our hungover bodies. The power of cravings can also overpower decision-making and impulse control. It's like a tug of war, with cravings on one side and our executive functions on the other. Unfortunately, cravings often win because they're in a more primitive part of the brain, leading us back into the cycle of addiction. Our higher-order willpower is time-limited and sluggish in response. It's important to understand that these biological changes aren't just a switch that can be flipped on and off. They are the result of continuous experiences, making them deeply ingrained over time and hard to reverse. Neuroscientists love the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. This leads us into the psychological level of addiction and relapse, that of associations and learned behavior. Can relapse be a learned behavior? The answer might surprise you. Think of it this way. Every time we give in to a craving, we teach our brains that succumbing to the temptation is acceptable. We teach ourselves that if we eat chocolate cake when we are depressed, our sad mood lifts. The next time we see chocolate cake, we think cake equals a happier mood. This repetitive use, be it of food, drugs, or any other addictive substance, reinforces certain thoughts and behaviors, namely cravings. It's as if we're creating a mental map in our brains, a pathway that becomes more established with each relapse. This path then becomes the default route whenever we encounter similar situations, which we call triggers. Now, you might be wondering, why would our brains do this? Well, our brains are designed for efficiency. They're always looking for ways to conserve energy, and one way they do that is by creating and reinforcing habits. Once a habit is formed, it requires less mental effort to perform. The neuronal path has already been formed. It just requires following the association to its desired conclusion. It is much easier than forging a new path each time we are required to do something. This is why habits, good or bad, can be so hard to break. It is just the brain doing its job. When it comes to addiction, this efficiency becomes our downfall. The brain starts associating certain situations, emotions, even people, with the addictive behavior or substance. These associations become triggers, leading to cravings, and often relapse. Over time, the brain learns to anticipate these triggers and begins to crave the addictive substance even before we consciously register the trigger. This learned behavior makes maintaining abstinence increasingly challenging. The more trodden the path becomes, the more the pathway becomes the default. It almost feels instinctual. Every relapse reinforces the connection between the trigger and the addictive behavior, making the craving stronger and more difficult to resist. This is why frequent relapses make the next attempt even more challenging. It's a vicious cycle, one that can seem impossible to break. But here's the good news. Just as our brains can learn to associate certain situations with addictive behaviors, they can also learn to associate these situations with healthier behaviors, and over time, triggers can lose their potency. If abstinence is introduced, the connection between the stimulus and the behavior will no longer be reinforced. It can even lose its potency over time. Understanding this concept of relapse as a learned behavior is the first step towards recovery. So, how can we break free from the cycle of food addiction relapse? Let's discuss some strategies. Firstly, the cornerstone of treating food addiction and relapse is abstinence. This means steering clear of foods that trigger cravings and lead to overeating. In many ways, it's similar to other forms of addiction, where the individual must abstain from their addictive substance. This bears repeating. Abstinence, or, to say it another way, not reinforcing the thought with the action of using, is the only way to diminish the power of the craving. This can be challenging, as food is an integral part of our daily lives, and we can't simply avoid it altogether. How can we stop eating, you might ask? But hold on, we can avoid ultra-processed foods, particularly added sugar, which acts as a drug to overstimulate our dopamine circuitry. Now, how can we identify which are our trigger foods beyond sugar? They do appear to be different for each person. Well, find the foods that you find hard to stop eating once you start. They might be foods high in sugar, fat, or salt. For some, it could be chocolate or sweets. For others, it could be fast food or salty snacks. Some people struggle with cheese, fruit, or nuts. Identifying and abstaining from these trigger foods is the first step towards breaking the cycle of relapse. Next, we need to address the cues that could lead to relapse. These could be social, psychological, or environmental triggers. For instance, you might overeat when you're feeling stressed or anxious, or you might find it hard to resist temptation during holiday times when there's an abundance of exotic food around. Recognizing these triggers and developing strategies to cope with them is crucial in preventing relapse. This might involve learning stress management techniques, practicing mindful eating, or planning ahead for social events where there might be tempting foods. While the critical first step is abstaining, it is often still not enough. This is where therapy and other treatment methods come into play. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, can help you understand the thoughts and feelings that lead to distressing feelings that become a trigger for overeating. CBT teaches you instead how to change these negative patterns and associations. Dialectic therapy can help you manage traumatic emotions that trigger overeating, and the 12-step model can provide a supportive community and a structured approach to recovery. Finally, it's important to remember that recovery from food addiction relapse is not a linear process. There will be ups and downs, successes, and setbacks. Relapse management is, after all, a form of learning, and learning by definition means making mistakes. Each setback is an opportunity to learn and grow. Also, it's crucial to seek professional help when needed. There's no shame in reaching out to a therapist, a dietitian, or a support group. In fact, it's a sign of strength and commitment to your recovery. We cannot do this alone, or we would have by now. Let's recap what we've learned about food addiction relapse. It's a complex and often distressing experience, much like a labyrinth with many twists and turns. But with understanding and the right tools, it's a maze we can navigate. We began by exploring how addiction develops and what a relapse is. We saw how relapses can be triggered by a variety of factors, from the company we keep to the stress we're under. The holiday season, with its abundance of tempting treats, can be a particularly challenging time. We then explored the intricate brain biology of relapse. The downregulation of dopamine receptors intensifies cravings, and the remaining receptors are on high alert, searching for more dopamine. This makes cravings stronger over time, even when dopamine levels are lower and normal rewards don't hold the same appeal. Unfortunately, each relapse just serves to ingrain this addiction dynamic further, making it harder to stay sober when you try again. Prolonged food addiction can affect our executive function, impairing our decision-making skills, impulse control, and memory. We also learned that relapse is also a form of learned behavior. The more we experience it, the more we learn that complete abstinence isn't a guarantee. But this doesn't have to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Understanding this pattern is the first step towards breaking it. Finally, we looked at the essentials of food addiction treatment. The critical step is to abstain from the foods that act as triggers. These drug foods reinforce the physiological and psychological aspects of the addiction. After this, it's necessary to identify and eliminate the triggers and cues that might lead to a relapse. This could involve dealing with emotional stress, changing social circles, or avoiding certain environments. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectic therapy, or even the 12-step model can be beneficial. They provide strategies for maintaining stability and freedom from relapse. In the end, please know that as far as sugar and processed food addiction are concerned, you are not alone. Nor are you alone in recovery. With the growing awareness of this condition comes a larger support network and more treatment possibilities, so that you can navigate the labyrinth of food addiction and come out on the other side, free from the obsession to eat. You will be happier and healthier, and you will find yourself in a community of like-minded people. Take it one day at a time, and remember, every step forward, no matter how small, is a victory. The power is ours.